"Take the hill," Rufus said, tossing the shed key across the pine table. "It isn't worth hitching a plow to anyway." The words were dropped as lightly as someone scraping away table scraps. In the spring of 1887, gathered around the table of their newly deceased father, Jonah Calderon, the three Calderon brothers were dividing up the family land. Rufus, the 45-year-old eldest brother who held the deeds, carved out the western bottomland for himself. Deep, black loam, a year-round spring-fed channel. Orson, 40, took the southern field and its entire irrigation ditch system. Seth, the 35-year-old youngest brother, was left with Buzzard Hill. It was a steep slope, bone dry, choked with basalt, crumbled sandstone, and barren sagebrush. "You're young," Rufus said, his eyes averting his brother's gaze. "You can still hire out." Seth looked up, his voice heavy. "Does the hill carry any water rights to the family well?" "No," Rufus answered flatly. "The well is on my parcel." Orson lowered his head, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. The air in the room thickened, yet absolutely no one spoke up to break the injustice of it. By the window, Seth's wife, Eleanor, quietly smoothed out the agreement. Her fingers gripped the edge of the paper tightly, trying to keep it from trembling. Her enduring silence was heavier than any spoken resentment. Seth uttered not a single word of complaint. He pulled the agreement toward him and signed his name with a firm hand. But before leaving the table, he picked up their late father's worn pencil and leaned over the map, ignoring the streams and the rich black soil his brothers had just smugly claimed. Seth's pencil point pressed firmly onto the slope of Buzzard Hill. With a slow, steady stroke, he circled a faint line crossing the barren hill, a trace of stone almost invisible on the paper. A secret buried by time, one that men who only looked at topsoil like Rufus and Orson would never realize. Their estate on Buzzard Hill was nothing but a weather-beaten wooden cabin. Seth and Eleanor moved in with their shaggy cattle dog, Tucker, and a bay mare named Morrow. Inside the musty shed, Seth found his father's true inheritance, a worn-down stone hammer, a coil of hemp rope, 2 marked measuring stakes, and a notebook with most of its pages torn out. Only a single line remained. "Water once crossed here before the lower ditch was cut." The note pointed directly to the faint line Seth had circled on the map. Childhood memories flooded back. He remembered Jonah showing him weathered stone rows nearly hidden beneath sagebrush. His father believed they had been built long before the first settlers arrived. Pueblo farmers and later Spanish shepherds had slowed water before letting it run downhill. And Seth recalled the teachings of Tomas Renteria, a master New Mexican stonemason. A wall must breathe. Early the next morning, Seth climbed the slope alone. Using a pry bar, he heaved a large basalt boulder out of the ground. Beneath that rock, which had been baking in the drought, lay no dust. It was dark, loamy soil, stubborn clinging roots, and a rising breath of cool moisture. Tucker immediately trotted over and curled up in the freshly exposed, shaded hollow. Seth knelt and pressed his entire palm into the damp earth to feel the pulse of the struggling hill. He said nothing. His calloused hand decisively swung the hammer, driving the first wooden measuring stake hard into the slope. Within days, Rufus and Orson were turning the valley floor with steel plows. Rich black earth rolled over in long, clean rows. Travelers passing the road nodded with approval. Everyone believed the best land had already found the right owners. Buzzard Hill could not be plowed. Instead, Seth stretched hempline between wooden stakes and used a simple A-frame level to mark each contour across the slope, moving every stake only a few inches at a time. Rufus climbed the hill at noon and watched in silence. "When do you plan to plant anything?" "After the ground can keep it," Seth answered. "The first hard rain would carry both seed and soil downhill." Rufus pointed toward his fields. "While you measure rocks, we are growing food." Later that afternoon, Orson carried up a sack of cornmeal. His offer came without mockery. A nearby rancher wanted the hill for grazing. Selling it would give Seth enough money for flour, salt, lamp oil, and little more. That evening, Eleanor placed the unopened sack on the table. How long before this hill feeds us? Seth looked toward the dark slope outside the window. I don't know. After a long silence, he said, Land cannot be held together by promises. Eleanor rested her hand on the sack. Neither can a household. Seth chose a shallow hollow near the base of Buzzard Hill for his first experiment. He never tried to level the entire slope. Instead, he laid out a 34-foot dry stone wall along a single contour line. Morrow hauled basalt boulders on a wooden stone sled from a nearby draw, while Tucker trotted ahead, sniffing through sagebrush and barking whenever a rattlesnake crossed their path. Tomas's lessons guided every stone. Large rocks formed the base. Flat faces looked outward. Through stones locked both sides together, the wall leaned gently into the hillside, and the top remained narrower than the foundation. By the third day, Seth's left wrist began to ache again. It was the lingering ghost of a crushed bone from a decade ago, back when he had helped his father clear rocks to expand the very bottomland Rufus had just claimed. Knowing the cost of pushing too hard, he stopped. Rather than forcing it, Seth cut a cottonwood pole into a lever and built a rough tripod to hoist the heaviest stones into place. Late each afternoon, Eleanor climbed the hill with water. 10 hours of labor had barely finished half the wall. Down on the valley floor, Rufus and Orson had already planted acres of corn. When storekeeper Harlan Pike heard about the project, he laughed. Calderon's Stairway to Nowhere. The nickname spread through the trading post before sunset. On the 6th evening, Seth lowered the final through stone into place. He rested one hand against the wall and pushed. Nothing moved. Above it, however, there was still nothing but loose soil, dry grass, and broken rock. A light rain arrived near the end of May. It never became a storm. Even so, runoff gathered behind Seth's first wall instead of racing straight downhill. From the porch, Seth and Eleanor watched muddy water slow, spread, and leave fine soil behind. The flow reaching the bottom of the hill ran noticeably clearer. The next morning, Tucker barked without stopping. Seth climbed the slope and found nearly 12 feet of the wall pushing outward. The footing stones were too small. Worse, one vertical joint ran almost unbroken from the base to the top. Another hard rain would tear it apart. Rufus happened to pass below. He studied the curve before speaking. Stone still slides downhill. You have only taught it to wait. Seth answered by taking the wall apart. For nearly 2 days, every misplaced stone came back out. He widened the foundation, replaced the smallest footing rocks, and staggered every joint with larger through stones. When Eleanor suggested bracing the weak section with wooden posts, Seth shook his head. Posts would only hide the mistake until stronger water finds it. That evening, his swollen left hand could barely hold a spoon. Eleanor picked stone splinters from his palm, laid the household ledger on the table, and quietly set a limit. They would keep building. But they would buy no new tools that month. Seth nodded. He accepted the cost before reaching for another stone. After rebuilding the first wall, Seth pushed the terraces farther uphill. Trying to save time, he chose the shortest hauling route. Morrow leaned into a sled carrying 3 heavy basalt boulders. Halfway up the slope, the mare's hind feet slipped across loose rock. The loaded sled lunged backward. Everything happened at once. Seth grabbed his axe. One swing. The tow rope snapped. The sled thundered downhill, smashing part of the newly finished wall. Morrow fell hard onto one side but escaped with nothing worse than bruises. From the valley below, Rufus and Amos Drennan, a neighboring cattleman, watched the accident unfold. "That hill will kill your horse before it feeds your family," Amos called. Seth ignored the broken stones. He spent the rest of the day checking every leg, hoof, and shoulder on Morrow. The damage was costly. 3 boulders lost. Part of a wall destroyed. 2 full days of labor gone. A ruined harness. The following morning, Seth abandoned the straight climb. Instead, he carved a long zigzag-hauling trail across the hillside, reducing the grade one section at a time. Every trip carried only one large stone, or two smaller ones. The work became much slower. The mare no longer had to fight the entire slope with her hind legs. That evening, Eleanor quietly cut one of her best pieces of canvas and stitched fresh padding beneath Morrow's harness. Seth had sacrificed progress without hesitation. The wall could always be rebuilt. The mare could not. By early summer, Seth had finished the first 3 terraces, stretching nearly 160 feet across the hillside. He never tried to flatten Buzzard Hill. Each wall served a single purpose. Behind every terrace, he layered dry willow branches, old sagebrush stems, weathered manure, fine soil gathered from the bottom of an abandoned wash, and a blanket of loose stone across the surface. The planting pockets reached 14 to 18 inches deep and sat far enough apart to keep runoff from collecting in one place. He planted flint corn, tepary beans, Hubbard squash, and patches of grama grass. Before a single seed entered the ground, Eleanor weighed every sack and recorded each row in her notebook. Harlan Pike agreed to extend only limited credit for the seed. "If nothing comes up before winter," he warned, "I'll be taking payment with your mare or your tools." Those words lingered long after he rode away. A widow named Martha Bell, who farmed a rocky slope at the far end of the valley, climbed the hill out of curiosity. She noticed Tucker sleeping comfortably behind one stone wall, while bare rocks only a few yards away were too hot to touch. Seth explained without ceremony, "The large stones make shade. The smaller ones cover the soil. The wall lets water slow down instead of stopping it." Martha studied the young squash plants. "You really think they'll grow in all this rock?" Seth looked toward the empty planting pockets still waiting for rain. "First, the roots have to survive the waiting." No sprouts had broken the surface. The dead had already begun to grow. Dark clouds gathered over Cinderback Ridge late in June. Rain fell for nearly 2 hours. From the shed, Seth, Eleanor, and Tucker watched water race across bare rock before slowing behind the terraces. Willow branches trapped fresh silt. Water slipped through the stone joints, clearer and gentler than before. Down in the valley, Rufus and Orson lost little. The rain simply was not strong enough to wash away good fields. On Buzzard Hill, Seth believed the system had passed its first test. The planting pockets filled with water. The soil stayed in place. Almost no muddy runoff reached the bottom. 3 days later, the lowest rows of corn began turning yellow. By the 5th day, nearly 4 rows had rotted where they stood. Amos climbed the hill and looked over the dying plants. "I told you," he said. "Stone walls turn fields into troughs." This time, he was not entirely wrong. Seth dug below the roots and found the problem. Fine soil lay too deep above a hard clay layer. Water had nowhere to drain, and the overflow sat higher than the root zone. Nearly a third of the trial corn was lost. He pulled back some of the stone mulch, mixed coarse gravel into the lower beds, and cut a narrow rock-lined spillway. The tepary beans and squash planted higher on the slope survived. That evening, Eleanor wrote only facts in her notebook. Water held 5 days. Corn failed where it had nowhere to leave. News of the dying corn spread quickly through the trading post. Edwin Harrow, a retired surveyor who had spent years laying out wagon roads and irrigation ditches, rode to Buzzard Hill expecting to prove the terraces were doomed. He arrived carrying an A-frame level, a plumb line, measuring sticks, and wooden stakes. Although Seth disliked strangers judging his work, he stepped aside and let Edwin measure everything. The first wall missed true contour by almost 4 inches across 30 feet. That slight error gathered water toward the southern end. Seth offered no excuses. "Where should the spillway go?" he asked. Together they checked the newer terraces. Edwin noticed the later walls followed contour much more accurately. Their foundations were stronger, their batter was correct, and the through stones locked the structure together.
We need to ensure that
Still,
every third
he
terrace has
pointed
a
toward
wider
the
spillway
hillside.
to handle the
Every
overflow.
third terrace needs a wider spillway, he said.
Grade here ensures
Line it with
overflow
larger
clears the lower
rock
course.
and
Use the
send
larger
overflow
source
onto
beyond
bare
so the water
stone,
follows the
not
bedrock
into
down.
another wall.
The terraces
Unknown to
slowly
either
run,
man,
allowing it to soak into the
Rufus
soil
stood
instead
below
of
the
eroding
slope,
hillside.
listening.
It will work, Seth.
When Edwin admitted the system could work if those changes were made, Rufus quietly turned away before Seth ever saw him. Before mounting his horse, Edwin looked back once. "The first wall was wrong," he said. "The later ones are not." Seth spent the rest of the summer correcting every weakness the hill had revealed. Together, he and Eleanor widened 3 basalt-lined spillways, added coarse gravel beneath the lowest planting pockets, and replanted only the crops best suited for the new conditions. They never replaced all the lost corn. Instead, they trusted tepary beans, Hubbard squash, grama grass, and a few rows of flint corn where drainage was strongest. By late August, Dry Willow Basin endured 18 straight days without rain. Down on the valley floor, Rufus's and Orson's corn still stood taller than Seth's, yet their leaves curled tightly by noon. Eleanor gathered 3 handfuls of soil. One came from behind the second terrace. One came from Rufus's field beside the fence. The last came from the bare hillside. She squeezed each sample in her palm. The terrace soil stayed together. Rufus's crumbled apart. The exposed hillside became dust. Martha Bell watched without saying a word. A brief shower arrived that afternoon. Red mud poured off the untouched slope. Water leaving Seth's spillways flowed slower and almost clear. 3 days later, nearly an inch of fresh silt rested safely behind the brush layer. Seth invited no audience. Martha carried a jar of damp soil to Harlan Pike's store and placed it beside a handful of dry valley dirt. For the first time, the gossip changed. People stopped asking what Seth was building. They began asking why his ground was still alive. Early in the spring of 1888, the snowpack on Cinderback Ridge melted far lighter than anyone expected. The spring channel crossing Rufus's land ran strong for only a few weeks before shrinking. Orson's old irrigation ditch exposed muddy patches nearly a month earlier than usual. Most farmers planted exactly as they always had. Rufus expanded his cornfields, convinced the previous season had been nothing more than bad luck. Orson sowed extra barley and grass for livestock. Amos Drennan even bought 2 more cattle, certain the summer rains would arrive. Seth chose the opposite path. Instead of planting more, he strengthened what already existed. He extended the terraces until they stretched nearly 760 feet across the hillside. He deepened the planting pockets, widened the 3 spillways Edwin had recommended, spread fresh stone mulch around young plants, and sowed fewer seeds with wider spacing. Eleanor finally asked the question she had carried all spring. Why leave good ground empty? Seth pressed another seed into the soil. Every extra plant becomes another mouth asking for water. By late May, the morning dew disappeared. The valley grass faded from green to pale gray. Fine cracks spread across the earth beside the ditches. Tucker began digging shallow beds beneath the shade of the stone walls every afternoon. Even Morrow needed longer rests after each hauling trip. Rufus still insisted the drought would break. Then one morning, the spring feeding his field stopped flowing altogether. Only slow drops reached the trough. Seth pushed a measuring rod into the deepest planting pocket. Several inches below the surface, the soil remained cool and damp. The drought had not delivered its verdict. It had only begun collecting evidence. June faded into July. No rain soaked deeper than a few inches. Across the valley, Rufus's corn curled before noon. Orson's barley formed thin, empty heads. Amos's pasture cracked beneath every hoof, and the plowed furrows baked into hard ridges under the sun. Rufus poured the last dependable water into the rows nearest his house. The outer fields were abandoned. Orson dug deeper into his ditch but found nothing except warm mud. Buzzard Hill looked different. Seth's crops were shorter. Far fewer filled the terraces, yet the tepary beans stayed green. Hubbard squash spread beneath the stone mulch. Flint corn on the upper terraces still stood straight each morning. Grama grass clung stubbornly to life. Eleanor checked her notebook again. After 23 rainless days, soil from the deepest planting pockets still formed a firm ball in her hand. Seth refused to call that success. He cut Morrow's water ration only as much as necessary, carried leftover wash water to the youngest plants, and leaned cut branches over tender squash to soften the afternoon sun. One afternoon, Martha Bell climbed the hill carrying an empty basket. She asked for no food. She wanted to know whether terraces could save her own rocky slope next season. Seth led her to a low stone wall. He never pointed toward the crops. Instead, he scooped up a handful of dark earth resting safely behind the terrace. "Crops can fail once," he said quietly. "Soil should not have to." Martha looked at the soil in his hand much longer than she looked at the plants. For the first time, she had come seeking knowledge instead of harvest. By August, Rufus's cattle carried their ribs in plain sight. The grass around the shrinking spring had been grazed to bare dirt. 2 young calves lagged behind the herd every evening. One afternoon, Rufus climbed Buzzard Hill. For the first time, he stepped across the terraces instead of stopping below them. He saw short but healthy corn, bundles of cured grama grass stacked beneath a lean-to, Hubbard squash hidden under broad leaves. Morrow still carried good weight despite the long summer. He never asked how Seth had done it. He asked how much hay remained. Seth knew the answer, because Eleanor had counted every bundle. There was just enough to carry Morrow, Seth's 2 milk cows, and 1 calf through winter. "I'll buy half," Rufus said. "No." Rufus looked across the terraces. Father would never let cattle starve while feed was sitting in the barn. Seth met his eyes. Father also never meant for one son to lose the well with the land. Silence settled between them. Then Eleanor came outside carrying her notebook. She studied the figures before speaking. "We can spare 8 bundles and 1 wagon of dried corn stalks." "No more." Seth nodded. Rufus accepted the feed without offering thanks. As he drove downhill, one of the weak calves struggled after the wagon. Seth watched the calf much longer than he watched his brother. That evening, Eleanor quietly crossed out the line in her ledger marked "Trade hay for flour." Kindness had cost them a winter comfort. She never complained about the price. Harvest began near the end of summer. The yield was never remarkable. It was enough. 9 bushels of flint corn, 6 bushels of tepary beans, 18 large Hubbard squash, a modest supply of grama seed and cured forage, and, most important, enough healthy seed to plant another season. Across the valley, Rufus gathered less than a third of the corn he had expected. Orson saved some barley, but the heads were light and poorly filled. Amos sold 2 cattle before they lost any more weight. At Harlan Pike's store, every sack from Buzzard Hill went onto the scale. Harlan checked the weight against his ledger. The seed he had sold, the flour and lamp oil bought on credit, the market value of the corn, beans, and squash. Without a word, he drew one long line through most of Seth's debt. Then he looked up. "You'll have extra bean seed next spring?" "That depends on winter," Seth answered. Eleanor opened her own notebook beside the store ledger. She compared every figure. Seeds planted. Plants that survived. Bushels harvested. Days the soil stayed moist. Bundles of hay shared with Rufus. The numbers told the story more honestly than pride ever could. The farm had done more than survive. It had produced enough to feed the household, keep the livestock alive, preserve seed for another year, and leave a small reserve besides. That evening, Eleanor quietly crossed autumn cornmeal from the family's debt list. She carried the first cooked Hubbard squash to the table. Neither of them said Seth had been right. They simply ate a meal the hill had earned. After the harvest, stories from Buzzard Hill spread through Dry Willow Basin. Some claimed Seth had simply been lucky because he planted fewer crops. Others insisted the rocky slope collected more night dew than the valley. Amos dismissed every explanation. "One real storm," he said, "and those walls will come apart like children's blocks." Rufus never joined the arguments. Instead, after checking his thinning herd each evening, he began walking to the foot of Buzzard Hill. He stood in the darkness, studying the long stone terraces stretching across the slope. One night, Tucker caught his scent and barked. Seth stepped outside carrying a kerosene lantern. The two brothers faced one another with a low terrace between them. "I lost a calf," Rufus said. Seth noticed there was no lead rope in his hands. He asked nothing. After a long silence, Rufus pointed toward one of the basalt-lined spillways. "What happens if the rain brings more water than the terraces can hold?" "The terraces slow the gentle water," Seth replied. "The spillways send the hard water onto bare rock. And if that's still not enough?" Seth rested the lantern beside the wall. "No wall gets to be certain before the storm." Rufus nodded once. Then he disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, Seth walked up to finish the unfinished spillway. A large basalt stone waited beside it. It had not been there the evening before. He never asked who carried it up the hill. He already knew. By the end of August, the drought had baked the valley floor until it felt like fired clay beneath every boot. The straight furrows Rufus and Orson had plowed in the spring now stretched downhill as dry channels waiting for water. One afternoon, Edwin Harrow stopped outside his cabin and looked toward Cinderback Ridge. Towering black clouds climbed into the sky. The warm eastern breeze vanished. A cold wind arrived from the north. The smell of dust changed into the scent of wet stone, though no rain had yet fallen. Edwin saddled his horse at once. When he reached Buzzard Hill, he found Seth repairing a terrace wall. "A storm after a drought is the dangerous one," Edwin warned. "Hard ground sheds water instead of drinking it." Seth needed no further explanation. He and Eleanor walked the entire hillside one last time. The northern spillway was still too narrow. Without wasting another minute, they began working. Morrow hauled fresh basalt into place. Seth lowered one overflow lip with his hammer. Eleanor cleared branches trapped inside the channels. Together they reinforced 3 low terrace walls before darkness settled across the ridge. Tucker raced from wall to wall, barking each time distant thunder rolled across the valley. Not long afterward, Orson appeared, breathing hard from the climb. "I tried to stop Rufus," he said. "He's cutting a straight drainage trench from his fields to the creek. He says the faster the water leaves, the better." Edwin looked toward the valley. "That trench won't carry water," he said quietly. "It will collect it. Then it will become a knife." Orson hurried downhill once more. He found Rufus still digging. "Edwin says it'll cut your topsoil away." Rufus never looked up. "When the rain comes," he answered, "I'll decide what to change. Not before." Orson stood there another moment. Then he walked away. Back on Buzzard Hill, the first raindrop struck a sun-heated basalt stone. It hissed. It vanished. Another followed. Then another. The sky opened. Rain hammered the valley harder than anyone had seen in 2 years. The baked ground refused to absorb it. The water ran. On Rufus's farm, every straight furrow became a channel. The drainage trench he had cut gathered dozens of small streams into one roaring current. It carved through the field, carrying away loose seed, rich topsoil, fence posts, and part of the road leading to his barn. Across the valley, Orson's old ditch overflowed. Water burst through the lowest corner of his field and tore down the southern fence. Amos fought to move his cattle toward higher ground. Halfway there, the muddy lane collapsed beneath the wagon. He abandoned the feed and drove the herd on foot. High above them, the flood reached Buzzard Hill. The first terrace shuddered. Tucker exploded into frantic barking. Seth and Orson ran through the rain. A basalt boulder had wedged itself across the northern spillway. Together, they drove a pry bar beneath it. Push! The stone rolled free. Water burst through the opening and raced onto the bare basalt below instead of striking the next wall. The third terrace filled. For one long second, it seemed ready to fail. Then the spillway caught. The water escaped. A short retaining wall, barely 9 feet long, ripped apart under the pressure. The damage stopped there. No other terrace followed. Below the cabin, Eleanor raised a lantern through the rain. The south spillway. A fallen branch had jammed across its mouth. Morrow reared at a crash of thunder. Eleanor gripped the mare's halter with both hands, refusing to let her bolt down the slope. Seth reached the block channel first. He dropped the pry bar. There was no time. He tore branches away with his bare hands. The current slammed into his legs. Another surge hit harder. It threw him sideways against the stone wall. Before the water could pull him downhill, Orson caught his coat and dragged him back onto solid footing. Beyond the roar of rain came another sound. Fence rails breaking. Cattle bawling. The valley was coming apart. Buzzard Hill suffered its own wounds. One wall was gone. Several stones had shifted. Fresh scars crossed the slope, but the terraces still stood. Each wall accepted what it could hold. Each spillway released what it could not. Nature offered Seth no reward. It searched every weakness instead. This time, most of those weaknesses had already been repaired before the storm arrived. Morning arrived beneath a gray sky. The rain had faded into scattered drops. Dry Willow Basin no longer looked like the valley it had been the day before. Nearly 43% of Rufus's planted ground had disappeared beneath muddy channels. Long furrows had become scars, and much of the rich black soil now rested in thick layers along the creek below. Orson stared blankly at the scattered ruin where the corner of his field and ditch had washed away. Meanwhile, Amos stood quietly beside the remains of the wagon road, mourning the loss of most of the hay stacked near his barn. Buzzard Hill had not escaped untouched. Aside from the short retaining wall torn away the night before, 3 terrace lips needed rebuilding. Part of the lower squash patch had vanished beneath the flood. Everything else remained. The main terrace walls still stood. Corn and beans still held their roots. Most of the fresh silt rested safely behind the stone walls. The seed shed stayed dry. Morrow and every animal were alive. Edwin Harrow climbed the hill with Martha Bell and Harlan Pike following behind. He drove measuring stakes into Rufus's damaged field. In several places, between 2 and 4 inches of topsoil had been stripped away. The main erosion channel ran much deeper. Then he crossed to Buzzard Hill. Behind Seth's second terrace, fresh deposits of dark silt measured between 5 and 8 inches deep inside the holding pockets. No one argued with the measurements. Nature already had. Rufus arrived last. Mud reached almost to his knees. He carried his hat instead of wearing it. Seth bent down, scooped a handful of soil from behind the second terrace, and pressed it gently in his palm. It stayed together. Dark, cool, still alive. Rufus looked at the soil, then he looked across his own valley. He never said he had been wrong. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. Which spillway failed? Seth pointed toward the northern wall. Rufus set his hat quietly on the ground. Without another word, he walked beside his younger brother, toward the damaged spillway. The days after the flood became days of rebuilding. Every farm across Dry Willow Basin carried fresh scars. Seth no longer had time to think only about Buzzard Hill. Martha Bell asked him to show her how to build a small check wall across an eroded gully on her own land. Amos climbed the hill again, stopping beside the damaged spillway. He watched watermarks still visible on the basalt. "I was wrong about one thing," he admitted. "The terraces never tried to trap all the water. They broke its strength." Harlan Pike arrived with a wagon carrying nails, hemp rope, and iron staples. "This spring," he said, I'll trade these for drought seed instead of collecting more debt." Before sunrise the next morning, Orson walked up the hill wearing work gloves instead of carrying excuses. He picked up an uneven basalt stone. "Which face turns uphill?" Seth handed him no answer. "Only another stone." Orson tried once. The rock rocked loose. He tried again. It shifted. Without a word, Seth turned the stone, found its natural bed, and settled the heavier face into the wall. Orson copied the movement. The third attempt held firm. He looked toward Seth but said nothing. Seth pressed his palm against the stone. He felt no movement. Then he nodded. Later that morning, Rufus arrived with a wagon loaded with rocks, salvaged from the fence the flood had carried away. Those same stones were stacked beside the northern spillway. While they worked, Rufus broke the silence. "Next season, I won't run my furrows downhill." It was the closest he came to an apology. Seth never answered with victory. He simply pointed toward the spillway. "Lower that lip another 2 inches." Rufus picked up his hammer. Eleanor climbed the hill carrying 3 tin cups of weak coffee. The brothers drank beside the wall they were rebuilding. No one mentioned the day the land had been divided. They did not need to. The 2 men who had once handed Seth the worthless hill were now carrying stones onto it with their own hands. Autumn settled quietly over Dry Willow Basin. The scars remained. Many of the valley fields would need years before they carried the rich layer of soil the flood had taken away. Rufus spent his mornings building low stone berms across the higher parts of his land. Orson rebuilt his irrigation ditch one section at a time, adding overflow points instead of forcing every drop through a single channel. On her own hillside, Martha Bell finished the first check wall with stones she had gathered herself. Buzzard Hill still carried its share of losses. Seth's left wrist stiffened whenever the mornings turned cold. Still, the farm had kept what mattered. The soil remained, the seed remained, food filled the pantry. Livestock entered winter with feed. Another season was possible. At Harlan Pike's store, the last line of debt disappeared beneath a stroke of black ink. Back at the cabin, Eleanor closed her ledger. For the first time since leaving Jonah Calderon's house, every page balanced. Morrow chewed dried corn stalks beneath the lean-to. Tucker slept in the cool shade behind the very first terrace wall, the one that had once bulged outward and been taken apart stone by stone before it ever faced a real storm. Late that afternoon, Seth walked to the northern spillway for one final inspection. Orson followed. "Did you ever think about giving up?" Seth looked across the hillside. "Most mornings. Nothing more." He bent down and picked up another basalt stone. He checked its shape, turned it once, set it into the wall. Buzzard Hill had never become richer than the valley below. It never created water. It simply held what nature offered long enough for the land to use it. Rufus and Orson had given Seth the rocky hill because they believed stone was proof that land had no value. The drought proved rich soil could still die of thirst. The flood proved deep soil could disappear in a single night. Buzzard Hill endured for a different reason. Every stone had been given a purpose, and when nature finally came to judge the work, purpose proved stronger than pride.